Tuesday evening around 7 p.m. Nothing special seems to be happening, at least on the surface. You're standing in a familiar kitchen, but inside, everything is stretched tight like a wire about to snap. The entire day hasn't just been exhausting, it's been a silent accumulation of everything you've swallowed. The words you didn't push back on, the emotions you pretended not to have, the times you chose silence to keep things stable. Then it only takes a very small moment, a glass slipping from your hand, the sound of it shattering, and suddenly it's not the glass, it's you who is breaking apart. The anger isn't coming from the present, it comes from everything you've been holding in. If you've ever wondered why you can stay calm for so long, only to explode in a way that even you don't recognize yourself, then this video is for you. Stay until the end, because what you're about to understand might change the way you see your own emotions forever. And if you want to explore the hidden corners of the human psyche more deeply, don't forget to subscribe and follow the channel, because this journey has only just begun. But what most people don't see is this: your body does not forget. Even if you smiled, nodded, and moved on as if nothing happened, that biological response is still there. It doesn't disappear, it is only postponed. Imagine that every time you say it's okay while you actually feel uncomfortable inside, you're placing another small stone into an invisible backpack that you always carry with you. One stone is nothing. 10 stones are still manageable. But after hundreds, thousands of moments like that, the backpack becomes so heavy that you no longer recognize what you're exhausted from. That's why the people who seem the calmest are sometimes the ones most likely to explode, not because they are weak, but because they have been too strong for too long. The problem is this: emotions, especially anger, do not operate on an on-off logic. It's not like a switch you can turn off when you don't need it. It's more like energy. And energy, by its nature, always needs to be released or transformed. If it is not expressed in a healthy way, it will find another path, usually at the moments you least expect. That's why something small, like a broken glass, can trigger a reaction that seems over the top, because that moment doesn't just contain the present, it is the final point of contact in a long chain of unresolved emotions. Maybe it was the time you were disrespected in a meeting but chose to stay silent. Maybe it was the time you felt abandoned but convinced yourself that you're overthinking. Maybe it was the hundreds of times you put other people's needs before your own, just to keep things smooth. None of those things disappear. They accumulate. And the most dangerous part is this: when you get used to suppressing, you gradually lose the ability to recognize your own emotions. You no longer know how uncomfortable you really are, because you cut it off the moment it begins. You don't give yourself the chance to understand it, to name it, or to process it. As a result, when the anger finally crosses the threshold, it is no longer a controlled response. It becomes an explosion, a full-body reaction, a moment where you are no longer the observer of your emotions, but completely swept away by them. And afterward comes guilt. You look back at what you just did and ask yourself, why did I react like that? You may feel ashamed, you may apologize, you may promise yourself that next time you will control it better. But this is the loop that many people get stuck in: suppress, accumulate, explode, regret, continue suppressing. And every time this loop repeats, it reinforces the false belief that the problem is that you can't control your anger, when in reality, it's the complete opposite. The problem is not that you lack control. The problem is that you have been over-controlling for far too long. There's a big difference between controlling emotions and suppressing emotions. Control is when you are aware of what you are feeling, understand why it appears, and choose how to respond appropriately. Suppression is when you deny that emotion, push it down, and pretend it doesn't exist. One is emotional maturity. The other is emotional delay. And ironically, society often confuses the two. People who suppress well are often praised as mature, reasonable, easygoing. But few realize that beneath that exterior may be a nervous system constantly under quiet tension. Because every time you suppress anger, your body still has to process it in some way. If it's not expressed outwardly, it will show up through other channels: muscle tension, poor sleep, chronic fatigue, or a sense of restlessness without a clear cause. That is your body's way of telling you something hasn't been resolved. And the more you ignore these signals, the closer you move toward the next breaking point. But there is one important thing you need to understand, and it may be the most important thing in this entire story. Anger in itself is not the enemy. Anger is a signal. It appears when something important to you is being violated, a boundary, a need, a value. It is your body's way of saying, this is not okay. The problem is not whether you feel anger. The problem is what you do with it. When you suppress it, you are refusing to listen to the signal. When you explode, you are letting the signal control you. But between these two extremes, there is always a third option, a way that very few people are taught. Learning to recognize, accept, and express anger consciously before it builds into uncontrollable pressure. Because true calm is not never getting angry. It is knowing that you are angry and still keeping the power to choose how you respond. And that is the first step to breaking the loop you have been unconsciously repeating for years. And when your nervous system gets stuck in that state of chronic tension, something very subtle begins to happen. You are no longer just having anger. You start becoming a state that is always ready to react, not always exploding, but constantly simmering like a small fire that never fully goes out. You may recognize this through signs that are hard to name. You become more irritable over small things. You feel exhausted even when you haven't done anything physically demanding. You find it hard to fully relax, even in moments that should feel peaceful. And sometimes you don't clearly feel angry. You just feel a vague tension that is always present in your body. This is not random. This is your nervous system working overtime. When the stress response is activated repeatedly without being released, the body begins to treat that state as the new normal. Your baseline heart rate may be higher. Your muscles remain slightly tense. Your breathing becomes shallower without you even noticing. And most importantly, your brain becomes more sensitive to negative signals. In other words, you're not just carrying old pressure, you are becoming more easily triggered by new pressure. That's why, after a long period of suppression, your tolerance doesn't increase the way you might think. It actually decreases. Things you used to be able to ignore now start to bother you more quickly. Small situations become harder to handle. And you may begin to ask yourself, why am I becoming so sensitive? But the truth is, you're not getting weaker. You're overloaded. Imagine your nervous system like a phone with dozens of apps running in the background. You can still use it, still perform basic functions, but the battery drains faster, the device heats up, and it only takes one more small task for everything to start lagging, freezing, or crashing completely. That is exactly how emotional outbursts happen. Not because the moment itself is too big, but because your system no longer has enough resources to process anything more. And when this goes on long enough, it begins to affect how you see yourself. You may start labeling yourself, I'm an easily angered person. Or worse, something is wrong with me. But those labels are often just the tip of the iceberg, because underneath them is not a person who is out of control, but a system that has been forced to operate under unsustainable conditions for too long. What's important to understand is that many people live in this state for years without realizing it, because they are still functioning. They still work, maintain relationships, fulfill their responsibilities. From the outside, they still seem fine. But on the inside, they are paying a very high price. They have to constantly self-regulate, self-control, and suppress. They have to think before speaking more than others. They have to weigh their reactions in situations where emotions could otherwise be expressed naturally. And over time, this not only creates emotional fatigue, it also creates a distance between them and themselves. Because when you continuously deny what you truly feel, you gradually lose connection with your inner voice. You are no longer sure where your boundaries are. You no longer know when you truly want to say no. And you may begin to live a life where most decisions are not based on your real needs, but on avoiding conflict or pleasing others. That's when anger starts to transform into other forms of emotion, often harder to recognize. It may turn into chronic fatigue. It may turn into indifference. It may turn into a sense of emptiness that you cannot explain. Or in some cases, it turns inward and becomes self-criticism. You are no longer angry at others. You start being angry at yourself. Why didn't I speak up? Why did I let that happen? Why am I always the one who endures? And the loop continues, just in a different form. But there's one very important thing that needs to be made clear here. All of these responses, from suppression, accumulation, and explosion to exhaustion, are not signs of weakness. They are adaptive responses. They are the ways your nervous system has learned to protect you in situations where expressing emotions was once unsafe. The problem is not that these mechanisms exist. The problem is that they are still being used in situations where you no longer need them. You are no longer a child who has to stay silent to avoid being hurt. You are no longer in an environment where every conflict is dangerous, but your nervous system is still behaving as if you are. And that is exactly why change is not as simple as deciding to be less angry or trying to stay calm, because the problem is not willpower. It lies in patterns that have been deeply programmed into your body and brain over many years. To break this cycle, the first step is not to control more. It is to recognize. Recognize when you are suppressing instead of processing. Recognize the small moments when you are ignoring yourself. Recognize that every time you say it's okay when it's really not, you are adding a little more pressure. Because only when you begin to see these things in real time do you have the chance to do something differently before the pressure reaches a point where you no longer have a choice. And when you begin to see the whole picture more clearly, an important truth gradually reveals itself. The problem was never that you were too angry, but that you were never taught how to understand and use your anger properly. Because if you think about it, for many years, you were probably encouraged to become a more pleasant version of yourself rather than a genuine one. You were praised for being accommodating, for staying silent, for not making things complicated. But very rarely did anyone teach you that saying no is also a skill, that feeling uncomfortable does not make you a bad person, and that anger, when understood correctly, is actually a form of emotional intelligence. This is the point where many people begin to change when they realize anger is not something to eliminate, but something to decode. Instead of asking, how do I stop being angry? A more useful question might be, what is this anger trying to tell me? Maybe it's telling you that you've agreed to too many things you didn't truly want. Maybe it's telling you that an important boundary of yours has been crossed too many times. Or, more simply, it's telling you that you've been ignoring yourself for too long. When you start approaching anger this way, something interesting happens. It no longer feels like something scary or out of control. It becomes a signal, a message, a valuable piece of data about your inner experience. And when you treat it as information instead of a problem to suppress, you begin to have more choices. You can pause earlier, right when your body starts sending signals. You can notice discomfort before it turns into anger. And most importantly, you can respond instead of react. The difference between responding and reacting lies in a very small moment, a pause. Reaction is when everything happens too fast and you are swept away by emotion without time to think. Response is when you create enough space to choose behavior that aligns with your values. That space does not appear on its own. It is built through awareness. For example, the next time you feel your jaw tighten or your shoulders start to tense, instead of ignoring it, you can try something very simple. Pause for a few seconds and ask yourself, what just made me uncomfortable? This question may seem small, but it has a powerful effect. It shifts you from an unconscious state to a conscious one, from being controlled by emotion to observing it. And when you observe long enough, you will begin to notice patterns. You may realize that you get triggered when you feel disrespected, or when someone doesn't respect your time, or when you are put in situations where you have no choice. These patterns are the map that leads to the boundaries you need to set. Because behind every instance of anger is often a boundary that has not been protected. And this leads to a very important shift from trying to manage emotions to starting to set boundaries. Many people try to deal with anger by learning to stay calmer, breathe more deeply, or control their reactions better. Those things can help in the short term, but if you continue to stay in situations that force you to suppress constantly, the pressure will return. A more sustainable solution is to change how you interact with the world around you. That can start with very small but decisive statements. I need more time to think. I can't take on more right now. That doesn't feel comfortable for me. At first, these statements may feel unfamiliar. They may even make you anxious. Because if you are used to pleasing others, setting boundaries can feel like doing something wrong. But that feeling is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that you are doing something new. And over time, as you continue to practice, something very important will change. You will no longer need to explode to be heard because you have learned to speak up earlier. You don't need to wait until your anger reaches its peak to act. You don't need to let pressure build to an uncontrollable point. You begin to release it little by little in small moments in a calm but clear way. And when this happens, not only does your anger change, your life begins to change as well. Relationships become clearer, respect becomes more mutual, and most importantly, you begin to feel lighter being yourself, no longer carrying that invisible backpack filled with emotional stones, no longer pretending that everything is fine when it isn't. What remains is something simple but powerful. You begin to listen to yourself. And perhaps that is what your anger was trying to teach you all along.